moving his agenda forward. Here with their analysis of the president's speech are three Republicans. Bob Dole, he is the former two-time congressman representing the 10th District on the North Shore. Christine Svensson, she is the Cook County Republican Party's general counsel and a member of the Board of Governors for the Republican National Lawyers Association. And Pat Hughes, co-founder of the Illinois Opportunity Project and president of the Liberty Justice Center. In 2010, he ran against Mark Kirk in the Republican primary for the U.S. Senate. Welcome back, all of you, to Chicago tonight. So Bob Dole, a former congressman, let's start with you at this joint session. What kind of grade would you give the president for last night's address?
Well, I think if you look at the address and you listen to it, I think that there were things that the president talked about that both Republicans and Democrats can agree upon. And I think that is a huge step forward, because ultimately families across our country that are struggling to make ends meet want our country to be able to move forward and actually get things done. And so that, I hope, is going to be hopefully the mood, and hopefully we can have some action coming out of this speech and in Washington going forward.
Christine Svensson.
I give the speech an A for the simple reason that Trump got across the following, that he is, excuse me, he acts in a presidential manner and will carry on his duties with America's best interests at heart and in mind. It was a heartfelt speech. It was a powerful yet conciliatory one. He showed optimism. It was a triumphant victory for him to appear in Congress and tell the American people, give them hope on both sides of the aisle. I think all Americans could take something out of that speech that they liked.
Pat Hughes.
I agree with Christine. I give it an A, and I think it's time for people to stop underestimating President Trump. As a campaigner, folks thought he couldn't win. Then in his first month as president, he was getting a lot of backlash for sort of the things that were going on within his administration, people calling for impeachment, nonsense like that. Last night proved that he is presidential. It was a great speech on content, but more importantly, Carol, it was great on optics. And when you look at the president compared to his main opponents, which are what? Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Elizabeth Warren, he looked very powerful, very assured, and they looked like they were in the minority that they are actually in.
I think last night there came the question, even inside the Republican Party, though, about whether this speech represented something of a pivot, because we've seen Donald Trump on Twitter, and we see Donald Trump in this particular speech on a teleprompter, and they are different. They are different in the way they're delivered, and they're different in their tone. Was there advice? Was there a pivot that went on that we were witnessing, Pat?
I think that there was. I think it's a different context, though, Carol, right? This speech is different than he's going to operate day to day. But the important thing to me about this is Donald Trump understands one thing. He wants to bypass his enemies, and a lot of those enemies and detractors are in the media, and go straight to the American people. And last night was an indication of just how powerful the presidency is and what he can do if he gets a chance to talk to 45 million Americans directly. So it was a change in tone. It was very smart, because I think you're going to see his approvals going way up.
Christine, did you see a pivot?
Absolutely. It was intentional, and I was very pleased by it. I'm not particularly enamored with the Twitter Donald Trump, and so I think this did set a new direction for him and his presidency.
Bob?
Carol, I think what we saw last night was somebody that is trying to reach out to Republicans and Democrats and realizes that governing is difficult. And if we want to do the big things that are on anybody's agenda, what needs to happen is that we need to have Republicans and Democrats be able to come together to solve big problems. And so I do think that you saw a pivot. You saw the tone and demeanor, I think, shift from certainly a campaign mode to something that would be far more applicable in that chamber at that time.
Some of the lines that jump out. I'm here tonight to deliver a message of unity and strength. The time for trivial fights is behind us. Solving problems require us working past differences of the party. Do you think there was a bipartisan accomplishment in this speech? I mean, do you think that some of that is resonating with Democrats today?
Well, I thought that there was a sincerity and an authenticity both in the content and the delivery. So I would say yes. And there was also that captivating moment involving, the widow of the Navy SEAL that brought everybody together. He handled it absolutely perfectly.
But at the same time, you've got the Navy SEALs' fathers calling into question the mission. You've got some sources within the government doing the same. Do the Democrats feel this bipartisanship yet? I mean, do you see that?
I don't think that they feel it, and I don't think that they're open to it. I think what's happened to the Democrat Party, Carol, is that they've moved so far left and have gotten so far progressive. And I mentioned the three people before who are in San Francisco, New York, and Boston. This is a far left party. So they're not going to be open, and they're clearly in the first month not open to the bipartisanship. But Trump was smart. He reached out to them anyway, and now has put the onus on them to come to him on his terms.
So, in boosting military spending by taking, what is it, $54 billion from other departments, we start getting into the granular pieces of this. Bob, does that work?
Well, I haven't seen where he's looking to try to get $54 billion. One of the things that I can tell you is that certainly in my time in the United States Congress, we tried to work across the aisle. We were ranked as one of the most independent bipartisan members in the Congress. And as we look at our defense, having a strong military and a strong defense will help us in the long run. It is a good thing to have, and certainly in the midst of a war on terror, that's positive. Where the $54 billion in cuts come from, I don't know. I haven't seen them. But what I do know that we need to focus on is we need to focus on growth. How do we talk about bringing more American jobs right here? Frankly, we'd like to see them in Illinois and in the Chicago area. And how do we talk about manufacturing? How do we put ourselves in the global marketplace on a level playing field to enable American workers to win?
So are you saying, from within the Republican Party, do you think that the Republicans in Congress have had enough specifics by which to make those judgments?
Well, I can't speak for what people have actually seen there. I can tell you that we didn't hear any specifics last night, and I haven't seen any specifics in the media or other places in terms of where the $54 billion in cuts would come from.
And when we talk about cuts, there's also the discussion of tax cuts. If you are going to, as the president hopes to do, vastly increase infrastructure spending, and at the same time change in some way or simplify the tax code, how does it all balance out, Christine? I mean, do you see it?
It's really going to be difficult. It was interesting that we didn't hear those details about cutting entitlements. I mean, there was no discussion about Social Security or Medicare, what he's going to do with that. But as far as infrastructure improvements, I believe that they are needed to move our country, to fix our airports, our roadways, to make a more modern, efficient transportation system that could rival Europe or other places. So I think that is a necessary thing to do. But we really don't know how he's going to come up with the money. He sort of, I believe, alluded to middle-class tax cuts. He has, I think, a division, or maybe he's coming closer to Speaker Ryan with respect to the border adjustment tax. Perhaps that is going to be raising revenues. I'm not quite sure where he falls on that.
So should tax cuts, Pat, be at the head of that agenda? I mean, what should be at the top of the list?
Tax cuts and repeal and replace of Obamacare for the very reason that will help pay for the infrastructure spending. In order to get the economy to grow, the business tax and tax on the middle class has to come in place. We need 3.5%, maybe even 4% President Kennedy, Ronald Reagan type growth, so we can start getting ourselves through growth out of our debt and our deficits. So those things are in place. And then repealing and replacing Obamacare, which is a giant regulatory nightmare, we can do better. We can deliver better health care for cheaper. Both of those things combined can get done with this Congress, and quickly, sending a signal to investors and to businesses that, we're open for business. I think those are the two priorities that should get done right away.
But at the same time, Bob, there's not unanimity even in the Republican caucus on these things, is there?
Oh, there's not unanimity in the Democratic caucus either.
Right.
And so that's
we're just
why,
talking to Republicans
but understand how difficult this is. As we talk about tax reform, and as someone that sat on the Ways and Means Committee, I can tell you that it's very, very complicated. But we do need to talk about how do we simplify our tax code. 70,000 pages in our tax code. And ultimately, it's about how do we come together, eliminate some of the loopholes so that we can lower the rates to try to make ourselves more globally competitive so that we're not talking about taking businesses overseas.
So what does he have to do? What does President Trump have to do to merge sort of the issues of cutting and yet building and spending? I mean, how does he accomplish it?
Well, if you look back at the time in Congress, just this last Congress, for the first time in 17 years, we figured out a way to pay doctors that take care of seniors. For the first time in 14 years, we had an education bill. For the first time in a decade, we had a long-term highway bill. And we're talking about infrastructure. The president wants to talk about $1 trillion infrastructure package. And ultimately, infrastructure, as we look at our economy, which Pat was talking about before, how do we grow our economy? Infrastructure is going to be key to that. We know locally here in Illinois, any business that wants to come to Illinois is going to look first and foremost at our infrastructure.
So how do we pay for it?
Well, there's going to be a number of things that we have to do in order to pay for it. I don't know that we have necessarily the answers, but we have to look at how those revenues are coming in. If we look at right now at the motor fuel tax right now is about $13 billion short. And the federal government is about 18.4 cents. The state of Illinois is higher, obviously significantly higher than that. The question is, can we use those resources in a way that enables us to be able to focus those into infrastructure?
Christine, did you hear what you needed to hear on immigration?
No, he didn't speak quite enough about it. It'll be interesting to see when his new executive order comes out as far as the double and those details. His idea about the merit-based immigration policy was an interesting one. I don't believe that I understand the argument about wanting, more highly skilled workers that come into this country, and maybe we have a higher percentage of those, but to actually state that we're only going to take highly skilled rich people, I mean, I'm not exactly sure that he said that, but if that's where it's going, I don't think that's the right policy.
And when we talk about the wall, Pat, do we have the money? Is it a good investment to put the money into the wall?
I think it's interesting, Carol, that the debate has switched from whether it's morally correct to do to whether we can pay for it. I think it's both morally correct to do because we can't have people who are not citizens of our country pouring over our southern border, and we secure ourselves in many ways all the time. So I think it's the correct policy. I also think that the money it's proper to allocate the money for this purpose. The federal government is so bloated and so sclerotic. There is money in there to do the appropriate things if we prioritize. And then in answer to the comment that you made to the congressman earlier, growth. Growth is the answer. We had 1.9% growth last year. If we can get our economic growth up to 3 and 3.5% through tax cuts, through reforms, through deregulation, then we'll have the money to do the things that we want to do, including building the wall.
You agree, Bob?
Well, I do think we talk about growth. It's absolutely critical that we talk about how do we grow. And again, we've been growing at 1%, 1.5%. If it was 1.9, I stand corrected. But ultimately, over the course of the last 50 years, we've had about 4% growth if you took it on average. And we need to get back to that. And if we get back to that, we're talking about an enormous amount of resources that's going to be coming into our country that we can use to spend on numerous programs that frankly need those resources.
But if you don't?
But if we don't grow? Well, I think we can grow, and that's the whole thing. I refuse to be a pessimist about this because I think our best days are ahead of us. And I think the American people want to believe that as well. We've got to be able to cut back on some of the regulatory red tape that's been out there. And again, we're not against regulation. We want our regulations to be smart, we want them to be tailored. But when we talk about just foisting more regulation on top of regulation, ultimately what we do is we end up stifling business, we end up stifling innovation, and that's not what we need to be doing.
So, Christine, one of the things that the president did last night was to talk about anti-Semitism and talk about race hate. Did it allay the fears of people who felt that he didn't do it soon enough?
I would hope so. I don't know the answer to that, but I thought it was well placed at the beginning of his speech. It was probably overdue, and so I thought he handled that perfectly.
Is there disagreement among Republicans about what he must do next?
I'm sure that there is. The congressman made a good point. It's hard for everybody to agree on everything. But I think he laid out a vision that Republicans, certainly this Republican, can get around and get supportive of.
And you weren't initially a Trump supporter, right?
I was not a Trump supporter. I came very late to Trump, like many, many people. But now, in the rearview mirror, it seems to me it was always Trump. And so I think we have to give him a chance. I'm a supporter now. What I saw last night makes me even a more firm supporter, and I think the party can rally around him and get things done.
Christine, where do you see disagreement among Republicans?
I believe that there will be real issues with respect to Obamacare. I'm not sure that Donald Trump is on board with Speaker Ryan's plan. The tax cuts as well, the border adjustment tax. There's going to be a lot of infighting
Those
there.
are real issues. And
Right.
Bob, last word on that?
No, listen, I think there are some very, very real issues out there. But I do want to go back to what you talked about before when we talk about anti-Semitism, we talk about hate and those types of things. I think it's very important that we make sure that the American people know that this administration, frankly, the Congress and America, that we will not stand for it. And there's no place for it in our nation.
Bob Dole.